Welcome to our set of mini lectures on the British home front. The idea of these lectures is to give you an overview of a range of issues that affected civilians on the British home front, covering the social and economic impact on civilians, a few issues around recruitment and conscription, how censorship was used, some of the propaganda that is used, as well as understanding how attitudes to the war might have changed over time. We'll also take a little bit of a look at the impact on women's lives and experiences in Britain. But in this little series here, what we're going to be doing is looking at it in a chronological order to get a sense of how these things developed and progressed over the war. So the set of notes that we have is these ones, issues on the British home front, and we're going to make our way working through these notes. The important thing to understand, first of all, is that this concept of the home front is very important and more important in World War I than it had been in many previous wars. And that's because we're looking at war on a scale that just had not been seen before. So in terms of the number of men, in terms of munitions and other supplies that's needed to support the conflict, it's absolutely massive, particularly as the war goes on and each government realises just what is required in order to maintain to maintain what they're doing in the war and in order to try to achieve some kind of victory. So it's undertaken in order to support the frontline fighting and also attempt to undermine the efforts of their opponents. And we're talking about economic, social and political systems all geared towards this idea of a total war effort. Okay, so it's a total war effort involving both the home front and the battlefront. Total war is a really important concept when we're looking at World War I. So we're looking again economically, we're looking at the way in which our labour force is being harnessed in order to develop the kinds of ammunition that is required in order to support the battlefront. Also, in terms of possible food shortages, how is the government actually encouraging the civilian population to make sure that they appropriately restrict resources, don't waste them, so that the economy can maintain and function effectively in order to support both the home front and the battlefront. We see a lot more women actually being used in a range of different industries because we have a labour shortage. All the fit young men are being sent off to war, and they need to be replaced if the home front is going to continue operating as effectively as is required. So you can see from this particular propaganda poster, it's aimed at men and women in a range of different roles. And we've got people operating both domestically in industry, as well as women as nurses, and certainly our different soldiers on the battlefield, all having to play a role in order to maintain this total war effort. And the question, are you in this in some way? And certainly this man on the side, not quite sure if he's actually involved in this total war effort. So at the beginning of the war in 1914, we've got to have this understanding that the British government really had a business as usual type slogan, because it's not really foreseeing just how long this war is going to go on and the massive effort that is going to be required. So in order to keep the home front under control, in order to support its recruitment campaign, we actually see business as usual. So at this stage, we've still got the women dressed in very similar styles and ways to how they were dressed before war broke out. We're maintaining our agriculture, maintaining industries without too much government intervention at this stage. It's only when we get to Christmas 1914, and as we know, the development of a stalemate, that we start to see that there are problems. Problems that the government now understands that it's going to have to address the way it runs the economy, the way it's running its labour, if it wants to maintain what's going on the battlefields of the Western Front and beyond. And if they are going to have any attempt at victory, they're going to need to more tightly control what's going on the home front. So one of the pieces of key legislation that is introduced is what is called DORA, the Defence of the Realm Act. You can see here, Defence of the Realm Act. Now, this piece of legislation has massive powers for the government that impact on civilian life. And while it's initially passed in August 1914, the important thing to understand is that the powers that are given by the Act are increasingly used as the war goes on, and increasingly actually have a social and economic impact on the civilian population. So some of the things, for example, that DORA introduces are an arrest without warrant and imprisonment without trial. So this is a huge interference in the British justice system, which upholds itself for making sure that there are fair trials, that somebody should not be in prison unless their guilt has been determined appropriately, and that you can't be arrested without due cause, which would be set out in a warrant. So this is very much an interference with the normal rights that the civilian population would have, and it's justified by the war effort and the need to maintain security within Britain. Another thing that is introduced by DORA are things like restrictions on opening hours of public houses, which are pubs, and also the watering down of alcohol. And both of these measures are designed to keep a much more effective population so that they're not drunk, so that they're not finding it difficult to get out of bed the next morning, and they're able to work very effectively in order to support the battlefront. We also, of course, see censorship of mail and newspapers is actually allowed by this piece of legislation. And we do see censorship of mail, particularly backwards and forwards to the battlefront. Soldiers had a lot of restrictions on what they were able to put into letters back home, so that they weren't going to reveal any of the strategic information about their location that might aid the other side, so the Germans, if they were able to intercept the mail and get information. Also, newspapers were censored, and this was about maintaining morale on the home front. Not leaking, but actually giving the certain types of information to the home front, and not giving them everything, things that might cause panic or stress, but actually aimed to maintain a strong cohesiveness and a strong morale on the home front. Another very important power that is introduced by DORA is the ability for the government to actually direct people into specific jobs. So, an obvious example here is that as they realise that the war is going on, they're going to need a lot more ammunition. They're going to need more uniforms. And so these war industries are going to need more people working in them in order to meet the demands of the battlefront. And so this is a form of industrial conscription. People can be forced to leave existing jobs and go and work in another kind of industry. Now, while DORA gives this power from quite early on, we don't see it really being used by the government until later on in the war, as things become more difficult and the government has to exert a much tighter control over the economy. We also see daylight saving hours introduced in 1916 because we're seeing our factory workers at home having to work longer hours in order to support the battlefront. And some interesting little things like flying kites and buying binoculars were made illegal, because with those you may be spying and obtaining information that could be given to the enemy. Feeding bread to animals was also illegal, because this would lead to wastage of resources, and the ringing of church bells is forbidden during the war. And there are only certain times when there was celebratory ringing of church bells, such as after the Battle of Cambrai, the tank battle we've looked at the end of 1917, when the government actually gave permission to ring the bells. It's also important to understand that at the beginning of the war, we see quite a lot of support from trade unions. So at the beginning of the war, it's not like people are exuberant about going to war, but they are certainly highly supportive of the government. So even trade unions, who had been having a lot of problems with the government, aiming for higher pay, better conditions, they kind of agree to abandon strikes and campaigns to increase wages at this point. And that's their way of supporting the war effort in 1914. We will see that change as time goes on. Conditions actually become worse for the workers, and our trade unions will get a little bit tired of just continuously supporting the government, and will go back to a more abrasive relationship with the government. Another important thing to understand, let me show you these photos which show us the kites. So you're wondering why flying kites is abandoned? Well, these pictures show us the way in which kites and balloons are actually used, with little observers attached to the bottom of these balloons, and they fly up. This is actually a German balloon, this one, about to be released into the air. And these men go up. Sometimes they're actually on telephones with wires that connect back down to the ground, and sometimes they are taking aerial photographs. So flying kites is a way that you can gather information from observation, and this is why it is banned in Britain during World War One. This political cartoon from 1918 gives us a sense that by 1918 at least, Dora is certainly being seen as a massive restriction and having a negative impact on British society. So we can see here the figure of Dora is represented by this female, and she's got so many things are forbidden by what she does. We can see that, the cartoon having a go at the British government. No ice creams, no treating, no high-legged boots. So it's certainly by 1918 feeling that Dora is being imposed by large, wealthy, strong officials, such as we see here on the left. And he is saying, go and see what the British public is doing and tell it not to. So by 1918, people are feeling the strain of the imposition that government is making on it. And we can talk about this as we get through and understand a little bit about war weariness. Another thing that is happening early on in the war is anti-German hysteria. And this happens from quite early on after the war breaks out. This is a painting, but it is depicting the attack of German stores. Okay, so here is the Schneider barber shop has been attacked. It's having furniture thrown out the window. And it's particularly fueled by news of atrocities that were happening in Belgium as the German troops were going through right at the beginning of the war as they're implementing the Schlieffen Plan. So anybody with German names were being attacked, poorly treated. Gets very ridiculous, the hysteria. And the cartoon here on the right is actually from 1917, because things got so bad as the war progressed that the British royal family, who were actually of German origin and had the name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, changed their name. You can see here sweeping away everything that connected them to Germany. And this is the point that the English royal family changes their name to Windsor, named after Windsor Castle, where they used to live. Also, this cartoon, while it's an American cartoon, gives you an indication of the level of hysteria. So sausage dogs were no longer seen as the kind of dog that you would want to own, because it is, of course, German. German sausages were suddenly called Empire sausages, same food, different name. And so there is an extensive amount of hysteria, and we can see here some further cartoons and posters. This one about the death of Edith Cavell in Belgium, getting people to remember what is happening and increasing the level of anti-German feelings in the community.